I hope you're enjoying your lunch, and please keep eating. I know everyone's probably hungry. I'm Gwen Rinke, and I am a governing board member of the Investment Advisor Association, and I also happen to be the co-chair of the IAA's DE&I committee. It is well known that in our industry, we continue to struggle with boosting diversity in our firms, and that the career paths we offer are not well known among the minority student population. This is a fact that has hindered firms from assessing promising diverse talent and has limited the number of high-performing minority students entering our industry. At the IAA, we seek to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion as a value for our industry. We believe this is consistent with and is also an extension of our core values here. And put simply, by promoting diversity, we are acting in our clients' best interests, and that is what we do here. Diverse views and backgrounds lead to better investment results. But before I introduce our panel, I want to do a quick pitch for our IA's DE&I committee. Whether you have an interest in sharing best practices, speaking on a panel, or working on education opportunities, recruitment, or pathways into the financial services industry, I would like to challenge this group to take what you learned today from the panel to the person in your organization who's responsible for DE&I and ask them to check out resources on our website and finally to consider joining our committee. They can learn more about joining by contacting Nancy Hancock. Nancy, will you stand so people know who you are? Nancy heads the efforts at the IAA. The other person that works on this is Rob Burks, who is my co-chair of the committee, and me. So you can contact any of us, and we would be very pleased to discuss our recent activities and future plans for the committee. So, without further ado, I want to present our panel. We are pleased to present a conversation with Keith Schultz. I work with Keith at Vista Equity Partners, and he is a totally dynamic force of nature. Keith's like, right, Gwen. And he really has some great ideas about how we can solve the problems that this industry and many other industries face. And joining Keith will be Amini Nagesh. Amini works in the funds and regulatory group at Kirkland & Ellis. Amini, thank you for joining us today. Thank you both of you for joining us today. And we want to preview a very exciting collaboration between the Student Freedom Initiative, which Keith is the Chief Operating Officer of, and the IAA. So without further ado, love for you two to come up on stage and talk about your wonderful plans.
Are we on, I think? Yes.
I think we are.
It is a pleasure to be with you today and to spend some time discussing something that's been at the forefront of the public discourse for the last few years, and that is attracting, retaining, empowering diverse talent, particularly in the financial services industry. Our two firms, Vista and Kirkland, have worked together on a variety of projects over the years, so it's really a joy for me to be here and to showcase what Keith is doing with the Student Freedom Initiative and what you're doing more broadly to create opportunities for diverse students. So I think a number of people in this room would be familiar with the gift that your CEO made to Morehouse College and the tangible expression that that represents of your commitment to alleviating challenges and providing opportunities for diverse students. So I was hoping you could share a little bit with this group about that gift, your role in its execution, and then how that ties to the Student Freedom Initiative and your vision for that organization.
Sure, thanks. Most people probably remember back on the 19th of May, 2019, where Robert Smith, as I called it, gave the most expensive lunch speech in history, right? And during that presentation, he indicated this need to put fuel in the bus. He really was looking at doing something that was profound in many ways, and there were a lot of people who followed after him. But at its core, the way that I took the presentation there during the graduation speech at Morehouse College there in Atlanta University, in Atlanta at Morehouse College, centered around something very simple. How do we deal with the wealth gap? On the surface, many people were thinking that, okay, we're going to deal with student loan indebtedness and the like, but it was really much more, much broader than that. It really was this thing called the wealth gap through the lens of education. Almost immediately after the gift, Robert called and says, okay, you've seen what's happened, go figure it out. That was the guidance that came out, because Robert is really keen on figuring out how to do the best thing possible using what many of the principles that we have at Vista Equity Partners, which is make certain that you find a solution that scales. And he realized that during that presentation and shortly thereafter that there are 99 more institutions. There are thousands and thousands. There's almost 300,000 students that attend minority-serving institutions, HBCUs in particular, and he couldn't go to all of those schools and do the same thing. It just didn't scale. And so his phrase of figuring it out was really, how do you find a way to address this systemic issue of the wealth gap through the lens of education, and to do it for HBCU students initially and minority-serving institutions more broadly, and to do it forever? Big challenge. To go figure it out took on a lot of different forms, but my responsibility for Robert Smith at the time was to execute the gift, but also to stand up what became the Student Freedom Initiative, and here's kind of how that turned into existence. The Morehouse gift, of course, he paid off not only the student indebtedness, but also the debts that parents had through Parent Plus loans. As we were doing the research on the Parent Plus loans, we found out that some 65% of the students that attended Morehouse College, as well as many of the other institutions, relied on Parent Plus loans for filling the gap after federally subsidized, unsubsidized, institution, Pell, and all those other types of loan products. And on the surface, that might have been enough for some just to deal with the issue of addressing this targeted alternative called the Parent Plus loan. But his issue of figuring it out was not intended just to deal with the student loan indebtedness problem. Although we know it's $1.7 trillion, and a large portion of that is in default or arrears if it's Parent Plus loans based on the way that those products are made available to parents. But he wanted to go one step further. Many of you probably have heard Robert's story, where he started off as an intern at AT&T Bell Laboratories in Colorado. He started off in high school, in fact, as an intern at AT&T. And he realized, based on that experience, as well as many others, that internship should be a key component of a holistic solution to addressing this issue of the wealth gap. So in addition to targeting what became this Parent Plus portion, internships was also a component of this program that we eventually stood up called Student Freedom Initiative. But we also found out that in addition to ensuring that students have 2 paid internships to deal with having hands-on experience in their career area of study, making certain that there was an alternative, a commercial alternative to the Parent Plus loan through an income contingent alternative, that there are many students who attend colleges, and it's not only the issue of paying tuition, room and board, but they have these one-time emergencies. The car breaks down. They've got to go home because they have a sick parent. We even heard stories where students would drop their laptops, the camera wasn't working, and their grades were suffering, right? Fires in their kitchen in their apartment where they had to find temporary housing. And so we also wanted to address the issue of microgrants. How do we deal with one-time emergencies that students incurred that needed some type of funding to overcome that particular challenge? And so we added that as the third component. And then the fourth component on top of this income contingent alternative, the internship component, and what we now call the microgrants program, is capacity building. And the best example on the capacity building side centers around this notion that came out in December of 2020, and the Department of Education levied what they identified what's called the campus cybersecurity. In that particular guidance that came out from the Department of Education, they levied a set of requirements on all colleges and universities, whether it's something the size of The Ohio State University or Clinton College in South Carolina, that if you receive financial aid through your IT systems, you have to protect those IT systems just like many of your firms have to protect all of your IT infrastructures. Well, as you can imagine, the Department of Education didn't put a timetable, but they levied the same requirement on all colleges and universities. So a college the size of a Harvard or The Ohio State University had the same set of requirements as the 170-member school called Clinton in South Carolina. The ability for those schools to meet those types of requirements it's just not possible. And so those are the four components that came out of what became Go Figure It Out. And yes, it's a challenge, but from the standpoint of those components, they all wound up doing something. Here's the other part to your question. Starting at the back end with regard to the income contingent alternative, many of you have heard of this small company called Cisco. Cisco recognized that this issue of cybersecurity was in fact a challenge. And so between Robert and their chairman, they worked out an arrangement, and Cisco decided that given the challenge that many of the HBCUs have, that some 80% of their students rely on Pell Grants, which is what flows through those systems, Cisco decided to write the check. They wrote the check at some $100 million to cover that requirement for all HBCUs, all 100 HBCUs. We also launched, in conjunction with a program called the internx.org program that has some 200 companies, 14,000 students, some 80 modules for students to upskill, along with a lot of other features that are part of that platform. So we went through a whole host of activities that are necessary to implement this simple issue of how do you address the wealth gap through the lens of education through those four components. And 2 years later, we have some 29 institutions that are included, some 41 about to be added, 5 states going to 12 states, and it's well on its way.
Wow. I think it's inspiring to see these. When we spoke, you used a phrase, I have a bias towards progress. Both Keith and I spent a long time in government, which tends to be very process-driven, and I think to be able to leverage your private sector resources in such a way, again, in a tangible, practical, measurable way, genuinely alleviate burdens for students and young professionals that might not otherwise have opportunity or incentive to pursue something that is for their demographic and still an unconventional career path.
Sure.
Can you share a little bit more about the Student Freedom Initiative, who comprises it, what the organization's goals are, and what you have worked on so far, in addition to anything you've already mentioned?
Well, the Student Freedom Initiative, again, it's really intended to address social and economic mobility of students attending historically black colleges and universities, of which there's 100, but it also is intended to actually go to other minority-serving institutions, whether that be Hispanic, Anapesia, as we call it, tribals, and the like. That's kind of the scope of it in terms of who's eligible. The income contingent alternative to Parent Plus loans, which is the first component, is tied to STEM majors. We originally started with those that are defined as STEM by the National Science Foundation, but we recognized pretty quickly as we entered into the pandemic that other careers such as health professions, aeronautics, and so forth also should be included within that definition. So we've been over time looking at the data and expanding the number of majors that are associated with this thing we call the income contingent alternative. Likewise, although it's STEM, it's also juniors and seniors. And on the surface, we've gotten comments back that, well, why not graduate students? Why not history majors and so forth? Well, we went to where the data is. The growth in STEM is probably faster and the like than any of the other majors that exist. And we needed to start at a place where we could actually demonstrate and manage our risk appropriately. And that's why we went with STEM majors, juniors, and seniors. We also found that because of the amount of dollars that were being asked for by these students, that we have a limit up to $20,000 per year for their junior year and senior year. And again, that's after all of the other free money, as we call it, in federally subsidized, unsubsidized institution and so forth. So students can receive up to $40,000 a year to cover the gap. We stand in the gap with regard to their college education. And then they pay back a percentage of their income after graduation. But we wanted to make sure that we were very student-centered in terms of how the program was structured. So if they don't make above 225% of the poverty level, they don't pay anything. If they go to grad school because of the income thresholds, they don't pay anything. If they go to work in a Title I school and therefore make below the threshold, they don't pay anything. And we really wanted to make sure that we recognize the fact that life happens. So even with those particular student-friendly provisions, there are many times when a student might be out in the workforce, they've been paying for some 15 years, what have you, and life hits and their car breaks down. So we actually provide automatic deferrals, where if they run into an issue that prevents them from paying, they have what we call an elective deferral, and they can use that elective deferral 12 times. So very student-centered in terms of the provisions that are associated with this income contingent alternative. Of those programs, in terms of what's identified in income contingent, of course, we use this platform called internx.org. It's been up and operational. It started with AT&T under John Donovan and Robert Smith because we recognize that many students just don't have the opportunity. So if you could envision Indeed and envision 200 Fortune 500 companies, 14,000 HBCU students, imagine all the professional certifications that you would think might be relevant, whether that be cyber, project management, Salesforce, cloud, those types of provisions and certification programs are on the platform. But in addition to that, companies like Apple and Google have certain requirements that they require of permanent students, those that they want to hire full-time. Even companies like Vista has requirements they have in terms of assessments and so forth that they take, which many of you may be familiar with. Well, all of those provisions, in addition to the self-enrichment that could come from these courses, but also a lot of these exams and so forth, are also on the platform so that these students are career ready. They're career ready when they come through the program. So with 2 paid internships, we believe that those 2 paid internships basically can help with addressing this issue of addressing the wealth gap, because the probability of a STEM student graduating after having 2 paid internships, there's pretty high probability that they'll actually have a job when they wait. The other I already mentioned, we were having discussions with probably some 30 or 40 of the HBCU presidents over the last year or so, and many of them found that many students with as little as $200 to $300 has been the difference with them persisting. I referenced the $1.7 trillion. A large portion of that is because students don't graduate. A large reason why they don't graduate could be for as little as $200 or $300. So based on one of the partnerships we have with Prudential, they decided that, just like in the case of Cisco, all the activities that Student Freedom Initiative does is through philanthropy. They decided that they would support a program with 9 of our original institutions. 7 of them are private institutions, 2 of them public, where they effectively agreed to provide a pilot program, fund a pilot program, where if a student has a one-time emergency, whether that be having to go home because of some ailment, their car breaks down, the school approves the emergency. They're the ones who define whether or not it's an emergency based on the conditions that the student conveys to them. It's all online in terms of how we do what we do to make that approval. If they approve that it's emergency, they approve the first 25%, and through the philanthropy of Prudential, we cover the last 75%. So there's skin in the game for everyone, be it the student, the institution, as well as Prudential that's funding the program for this 3-year pilot. So that's this thing we call helping everyday life, handling everyday life problems for students helps, and that's up and running. It started this current semester based on agreements that we have with the folks at Prudential. And then finally, I'll expand a little bit on the 4th component, this issue of capacity building. Many are not as aware, but there was a study that came out last summer, and the study basically identified that some 82% of the historically black colleges and universities are sitting in broadband deserts. 82% because of where they're located. Many of them don't have broadband on their campus, and when they do, it's very localized in certain areas of the campus. And so as part of our approach to manage our risk, there are a series of pilots that we're working at several HBCUs to use different technologies, whether it be wireless or wired, to actually provide broadband capabilities on some of the campuses. And of course, Cisco, because they're a very good partner along with AVC Technologies, are working with us on some of those types of pilots. But we're also not yet to be identified. Generally, these communities tend not to be at the cutting edge of new technology. I was having a discussion earlier today with another organization, and the issue of clean energy. We were approached by an organization that's focused on clean energy, and they, like we will get to here in a minute, wanted a bridge to historically black college universities based on where they are. So we will be providing a pilot that provides probably up to 5 megawatts of power, solar, on an HBCU campus, as well as in the local area, powering some 1,000 homes, providing jobs to communities, tax revenue, internships, and career readiness opportunities for even the residents that are within the community. And that's kind of what the power of solving some of these issues with regard to the wealth gap, because in some of these communities, if you take, like what Cisco is doing, the average income for folks in South Carolina, the family could be in the $30,000 range. If you take the work that Cisco or some of these other activities are involved in terms of some of these STEM professions where they can actually work from home, the salary that some of these young people could make is twice the salary of their family income, which is what we were trying to do to address the issue of social and economic mobility by improving this issue with the wealth gap. So those are the 4 components. It's exciting in many regards regarding the types of things that we're able to do in conjunction with, again, whether it be Cisco, AVC Technologies, Prudential, even Jane Street. Many of you all probably are familiar with Jane Street out in New York, and I was telling earlier today that the program that we'll speak to here in a minute with regard to providing on-ramps and a better understanding of what the financial services industry looks like, we just finished doing that in the fall. The folks at Jane Street had a program that they wanted to initiate as a pilot to see how well it went, again, managing the risk. And we actually had that program in the fall, and we had several students from across multiple HBCUs participate in that program because the person who started, she was a female, and when she was going through her college, and after she had said she didn't know what the financial services industry was. And she realized that not only did she have that issue, but she also realized that there were others, so she took the lessons that she had learned as a female and how it helped her to start expanding that program to those students that are primarily at HBCUs. So they expanded their program, and so this, and what we'll speak to here in a minute, is very similar to that. So expansive program in terms of the components that we're addressing, but all tied back again to this mission. We're 501c3, our whole purpose and reason for existence is to address this wealth gap, and we try to do that by elevating the social and economic mobility of the students in particular, and where necessary, expanding the capacity of the institutions to enable that.
When a group of us came over from the SEC to Kirkland, one of the things that we wanted to do, not necessarily because it tied to our practice as much as we wanted to do something for our community as well as go to the source of diverse talent. So we have been teaching as a team this class at Howard University Law School for the last few years, which, you know, I worked with a group of former regulators who like to teach and like to lecture, and so we just did it because we wanted to. We were excited for the opportunity to be with the students, but I think we're in our 4th or 5th year, and it has proven to be a natural pipeline. You get the kids excited. I mean, these are a lot of students that might have considered constitutional law or some other area of the law. They get exposure to private equity and hedge fund regulation early on, and they start considering a career in corporate law. And so it has been really exciting to see how that organically translates into enduring relationships. They summer with us, and now we actually have people in our practice that were our students. So getting to engage with the students young, early in their educational career, in their education and career makes such a big difference. So I think this group would like to know why the IAA and their membership would make for good partners for the Student Freedom Initiative and what you're hoping to accomplish with this collaboration.
Yeah, I introduced Jane Street to allow me to bridge into this answer. 650 or so members, many of which are in some regards associated geographically, but it need not be geographically, with a large number of the minority serving institutions, the HBCUs in particular. Many of the students that we've seen at these college universities are looking to see what's possible. They're looking to see what's possible in a financial services industry. When Robert started decades ago, there weren't many people who looked like him. Even today, in many cases, there's still not many people who look like Robert or me or Martin or many of the other diverse talent that we have there at Vista. And so part of the intent was, if we can expose, not just through this one instance of one company called Jane Street, that doesn't scale. That's like Robert going to Morehouse and doing something for 400 students for 1 year. It doesn't scale. Mm-hmm. And so the intent, at least what we're envisioning, is find a way to scale that aspect of the program in the same way Robert wanted us to, quote, figure it out. So as part of figuring it out, how do we find a way to scale across the entire financial services industry to provide opportunities for these students who would otherwise not have that opportunity? So it's really about scalability. We can scale collectively better than we can individually, and we thought that the relationship with Iaa would allow for that scaling.
So a lot of these firms that are represented in this room are going to have internship programs and existing, maybe even things that are specifically targeted to diverse talent. What is your vision for how working in collaboration with the Student Freedom Initiative would help them to do that even more effectively? I know that one of the things that you've been thinking about developing is the best practices. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Sure. Part of what Robert stressed coming out of the Morehouse gift was, in order to scale the program, and Gwen knows this because she knows about our best practice inside Vista, if you don't document the best practices, not scale, you can't repeat it. It can't be done. And so we created a best practices playbook coming out of the Morehouse gift. We leveraged that best practices playbook in many regards for some aspects of what we've done on Student Freedom Initiative. In terms of how we can actually do something, one of the core tenets we had in the program was this whole notion of being evidence-based and sharing information, exposing, documenting, reporting, and so forth. We have what we believe is soon to be one of the single largest repositories of information on historically black colleges and universities that exists. Of course, we use Salesforce. Of course, we have Power BI that's the graphical representation of it and all those kinds of things. But we believe that it's important for all organizations to be transparent. And so those institutions, those that are represented here that have those types of programs, it would be very helpful if show what you're doing. If you have an internship program, expose the demographics of your internships, right? Whether that be 10, 50, or 100. Coming out of what we've been finding is that over the last 2 years, there have been a lot of promises made and a lot of promises not kept, candidly, with regard to this era that we're in. And so one way to improve upon that is to increase transparency. If institutions or organizations have internship programs, then let's show us how good your internship programs are. As part of the internx.org activity that Linda Wilson is the executive director for, they have a series of best practices that they require people to follow if they're going to be on the platform. There are organizations that follow the best practices, but I'll use an example that's not reflective of any organization in this room. But if an organization has several thousand interns that they hire each year, and them to have in the single digits the number that represent any of these minorities, then one might wonder. In many cases, the feedback that we receive is we can't find the talent. I can tell you, having visited over 40 of the HBCUs, and I'm going to visit 15 more here in the month of April, that the talent is there. If you fish where the good fish are, you will find the talent, simply. I went to Cornell, right? If you go to Cornell, there were probably 15 or 20 different companies seeking me at Cornell. Likewise at Harvard and Yale and UPenn and Stanford and so forth, and that's where many companies go fish. Well, not as many companies go fish at Clinton College in South Carolina, or Tougaloo in Mississippi, or Maryland Eastern Shore here locally, or any of the smaller schools. So our intent is, if you can actually, if you're doing good work, show people your best practices and that you're doing good work. Because many organizations are looking for ways to do what many of you are doing in terms of your best practices. And so if you're doing good work and you don't tell anybody, they'll never know. And one way to do that is with greater transparency in terms of your individual programs and what you're doing through organizations and sharing it through trade organizations and the like, as well as put it on your website. If you've hired 1,500 interns and of those 1,500, 88% of them transition to full-time employment, that's a good metric. And so from an evidence-based perspective, what are the metrics that each organization uses to determine whether or not your internship is effective? It's not just, did I bring somebody in and have them have an internship and none of them ever get hired? That's not a good metric. The fact that you have lots of interns and they don't get hired, not good. Using just gender is not necessarily the best metric either, because it doesn't capture all the different ethnic groups that might be necessary to be reflective of those that have been historically disadvantaged. So that's kind of thing. Show the information, be transparent, demonstrate your best practices, or show them in a meaningful way with metrics that can be measured and shared with others so they can benefit from the same information.
Can you tell he's an engineer by training? The emphasis on metrics and measurable, quantifiable, evidence-based.
It's just easy. People can change the numbers, but the numbers are what they are. Most people can do whatever they need to with the numbers. But I think part of what we wanted to do was ensure that as we built the program, in this case, Student Freedom Initiative, that we had the data to support the decisions that we were making. So that it's credible, so that it can withstand scrutiny, all the due diligence that one would want to do in any arrangement that they had. So we rely pretty heavily on the data to help us drive what decisions we make next.
Knowing that the vision and the challenges will evolve over time, what do you think success would look like for the partnership between the IAA and the SFI?
I've had this discussion with Nancy, so I'm going to go a little bit further, Nancy, on what success looks like. We're currently working an interim success measure. Again, it's managing this risk thing. So starting off here in Washington, Baltimore, with what we call a pilot, and making certain that I just had a discussion with the folks over at Howard as well as University of District of Columbia, stand up a pilot. What would that pilot look like in terms of who the participants are, what the level of engagements are, what resources are requirement, how is that relationship going to be built over time? A one-time engagement is probably necessary but wholly insufficient to develop a relationship. And so our intent is to ensure that there are these partnerships that exist between and in this case, the pilot between institutions in the Baltimore metropolitan area, the DC metropolitan area, and hopefully Charlotte metropolitan area, to build those relationships between some number of member organizations as well as the HBCUs that are in those communities. That could be anywhere from, like you all set up a program at Howard, best practice, right? In terms of how that type of relationship could unfold over time. It didn't take 1 year, it took how many?
Well, ours is for upper class students. We're probably in the 4th or 5th year. Alpa would know. She's a lecturer.
4 or 5 years. So measure of success, a long-term strategic partnership.
Yes.
5 years or so to make sure that we can actually see the evidence, data back to data, so we can see the evidence associated with that. But that's not to mean that other pilots can't start in other locations, to be clear, because the whole notion behind scaling is to learn as we go. And so the lessons that are learned as part of standing up the relationship can actually be leveraged in other locations across the 650 or so member organizations. So success is those 2 pilots standing up effectively within the next 6 to 12 months, because many of your firms probably hire interns or go through the process starting in the fall. And so we've got this natural window between now and the fall to do whatever co-marketing activity is necessary between the respective organizations to be in a position in the fall to actually do something meaningful as a pilot within those 3 locations. Learn from what goes on in the process over the fall in terms of the selection process that's necessary, and then be positioned next year this time when we report the results of how well we've did in terms of the data, see how we can call others to action in terms of other geographical locations, because we've got, like I said, we've got some 29 institutions currently that are prepared to have this type of interaction, and we have 41 that we're in discussions with to add to it. So the issue of talent is not the issue. The real issue is how many of the member firms are willing to take the leap of faith like your company did and say that we're prepared to take this leap. And so success is those 2, hopefully 3 pilots starting this fall, and then by next year reporting the results of how many interns actually came through the process, and then leveraging that experience to continuously add additional, and at that point it won't be a pilot because of course we'll have a best practice playbook coming out of that, right? And so coming out of this first year, we should have pretty good data to allow others who choose to do the same to do likewise next year this time.
You have a lot of support right from the senior most level of your organization for these initiatives, and can you just speak a little bit to how important that is, that this be a priority from the very top?
I'll give you an example that started way back when. When Robert says, go figure out a way to make it happen, that puts a lot of things in motion. I'm in the office of the CEO, as Gwen sort of alluded to, and the fearful part is when she sends me a note and says, Keith, we need to talk, I think bad things are about to happen. But when Robert sends me a text message when he's in Europe saying, we need to figure out a way, and he's saying, I need it by tomorrow morning, if he's in Europe or the Middle East, that's like really late here, right? And so if I need it in the morning, to me, that's work all night, right? And so from the standpoint of the commitment that Robert has, his commitment is pretty adamant. He's concerned about these inequities. He's concerned about whether it be inequities in access to capital, education, food insecurities, you name it. There's a series, if you've heard him speak, and the leadership is clear and it's unequivocal in terms of his emphasis on addressing these disparities. And in the case of education, it goes without saying that because of what he did at Morehouse and what he continues to do in education, whether it be the most recent work that he did with contributions at Columbia and Cornell, it's not just HBCUs, it's education writ large. The fact that he's focusing on those institutions that represent some 4% of the college and universities, but graduate 14% of all black graduates, 25% of all STEM graduates, and 50% of all black female PhDs, notwithstanding, that's why we're starting there, right? And so leadership at the top is kind of the key. That's likewise why Cisco got involved, because Robert and Chuck have this great relationship between the two of them, and it also started at the top. When he realized that there's this issue of some 80+% of HBCUs requiring funding from the federal government based on Pell, he also came online. Same thing with AVC. All those who came online because the CEO, the C-suite, basically recognized the challenge. And when the C-suite recognizes the challenge and says, go make it happen, people tend to see that it's important. And so I get it. If the C-suite doesn't feel that it's important, it doesn't happen. But when they do, things get put into motion to make sure that we get positive outcomes. And again, as long as they're measurable outcomes where people can see that there's actually some benefit to it, it actually moves pretty well.
So if anyone in this audience would like to get involved with the Student Freedom Initiative, how should they follow up?
Anyone who is interested in getting involved either in Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Charlotte, or any other location sooner if they would like to expand, because I would love to do more, right? I would love to do more. We're working with Nancy, as many of you know, and Nancy can put you in touch with the rest of the team, but you can also, and I hesitate to do it, but I'll say it because it's that important, I can be reached at Keith Schultz at studentfreedominitiative.org, right? And as well as Mark Brown, M. Brown, at studentfreedominitiative.org, and we'll be glad to engage with you all through Nancy and the team, because you're going to be working with us, right?
Yes, delighted.
Delighted. And so our intent really is to provide, as I indicated, we really want to address this issue of the wealth gap. We recognize that many of these students that are attending minority-serving institutions, HBCUs in particular, don't have access to the opportunities that most people consider common. They just don't. Many of the students, here's an example of a student. When COVID happened, the college in Columbia, Benedict, their dorms closed. And the president was telling us the story about a particular student. Tell me if you would want to hire this student. The student had no place to live, so she lived in her car, outside of Chick-fil-A where she worked. Because she lived in her car and she had homework assignments, she did her papers on her cell phone, in her car, because she was homeless. And she progressed through and did extremely well in all of her academics. Homeless, had a job, did her homework in her car. Do you think that person would be a valuable contribution to your workforce? Probably. There's countless students like that, and most people don't know. But between Mark and I, we visited some 40 or 50 of the HBCUs, talking to their presidents, their provosts, their academic deans, their student affairs, and the like. And we firmly believe that if you have a desire to do so, there is talent that's there. We're mission aligned already in terms of the two organizations, so we think between us we can scale the program to address this thing that most of us want, which is to provide opportunities to these folks that otherwise wouldn't have the opportunities, and in the process address this wealth gap through the lens of education, and education without internships is dead. You don't have the hands-on experience necessary to be productive when you leave college and enter into the workforce. So that's kind of what I would suggest. Contact Nancy, of course, Gwen, of course, because she's here to DI, you, of course, and you can contact us directly at studentfreedominitiative.org. And all the data that I just mentioned in terms of the institutions that are currently participating in the program, of course, you can find there. Of course, you can find all of our corporate supporters. Again, everything that we do is based on philanthropy, but reach out to us. We do have a set of best practices that are available, even remote internships. There's a document that identifies best practices for those who want to do more remote internships. And of course, there is relocation assistance that's available for those students who might need it also, because one of the things that Robert wanted to do is remove all the obstacles to those people who might be otherwise inclined not to participate. So there's no cost for the student or the corporation to participate on the internx.org platform. There's no cost for anyone to participate on that platform. And there's relocation assistance that's available as well. So if you take all the obstacles out of the way, the only thing that's left is the willingness to do so.
Keith, thank you so much for your time. Thank you to the IAA and to Nancy for your leadership on these issues. It has been a delight to hear about the program. And I know on behalf of Kirkland, we're very excited to partner with you.
Yeah, I am too. This is going to be great. Thanks.
Thank you.
So much.